It's Wednesday, December 11th, 2019, and this is KBIA's News of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues, Kiely and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, a lot of changes at newspapers across the country as staff reductions begin at what was the GANNETT and the Gatehouse newspapers, including here in Columbia, and the hedge fund that decimated the Denver Post gets a seat at the Tribune publishing table. We'll also talk about the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's demand for a disclaimer in Clint Eastwood's newest film and why it says the depiction of one of its female reporters in Richard Jewell isn't fair. And that cringeworthy commercial for the Peloton exercise bike and the unintended consequences it's had for the actors in it. There's a lot more that we'll hopefully get to as well before our half hour is up, but we're going to start with what could be one of the most important pieces of investigative journalism to drop in decades, and it went practically unnoticed yesterday, in large part because of the timing with the articles of impeachment coming down against President Trump. The Washington Post published what it's calling the Afghanistan Papers, playing off the Pentagon Papers, because this too documents the way that the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations have known the 18-year-long war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is, like Vietnam, unwinnable. The Post has been working on this story for more than 3 years, fighting in the courts to get access to some of these documents. The thousands of pages that have now become available, telling a very, very important story.
Yeah, and I think the fact that the Post had to fight so long for this is probably the most important backstory here, and that is because the Post has deep pockets, thanks to Jeff Bezos, and they are able to fight these fights. I've talked here at Mizzou, our law school dean, Larissa Litsky, is a media lawyer, and she and I have talked about this before, that a lot of the law that makes these kind of disclosures possible, the FOIA laws, the libel laws, the things that make aggressive journalism, public advocacy journalism possible, really was created in the late 60s and early 70s by a series of legal challenges that were really fronted by major media organizations. And I know we're going to talk a little bit later about the economy of the news. And I think this is one of the concerns that we really have, is that absent those deep pockets, who's going to fight those battles? And it's fantastic that the Washington Post was able to do this, but you have to wonder about the local newspapers, because there's lots of information that might be relevant only to a single city or a single community, and who's got the deep pockets to fight those legal battles.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge fight there that's not going to be waged, mainly because, as you said, the economic problems that local newspapers are having. One of the things about the Afghanistan Papers, as they're calling them, that I think is different than the Pentagon Papers is that you had the legal challenge, but it was more of a procedural thing as opposed to what happened with the Pentagon Papers, where it came directly from the White House. You had Nixon was fighting it. It went straight to the Supreme Court. And you had a concentrated effort on the part of major media, both in terms of newspapers and television, that was fixated on this. Whereas here, you have the Washington Post, the New York Times has covered it a little bit, but it was mainly the Washington Post. But it was, as you said, you had the indictments coming out. Not the indictments, but the articles of impeachment against the president that came out. And you have a different media environment in which you have a splintering of political as well as mainstream news organizations that are more fixated on other things than they are on something that is of major importance like this is.
Is part of it, too, maybe the difference in the way that the war in Afghanistan has been covered, too, that it's not front of mind the way Vietnam was at the time that the Pentagon Papers came out?
Absolutely. I mean, you have a difference here. The major difference between Vietnam and Afghanistan is the draft. And you did not have a draft in Afghanistan. You did in Vietnam. There were people who were trying to avoid it. You had protests all over the country, in particular on college campuses, related to the draft and related to Vietnam and why we were there. You didn't have that groundswell. You had more patriotism in Afghanistan as opposed to Vietnam. And the other big difference is that we went to Afghanistan because of a direct impact on our country when the terrorists hit the 9/11, Al-Qaeda, that sort of thing. So that, to me, those are two major factors in the differences between the two wars.
So the Afghanistan Papers is a reminder that newspapers are not dead, that reporting is going on, and that it's important reporting that has impact. But not every metro has the same staffing or resources as the Post, and we were talking about that. And it became even more real this week as the axe fell at GANNETT. Hundreds of jobs were lost, and the legacy papers at GANNETT and the Gatehouse papers, according to some crowdsourced spreadsheets that are linked on our links blog, there were also 3 jobs that were lost here in Columbia at the Columbia Daily Tribune. One of those that was listed was the sports editor. That, to me, in a market like Columbia that is so centered on Mizzou and on Preps sports, I would think the sports editor would be one of the most pivotal jobs in that newsroom.
I would agree. I mean, it wasn't just the Columbia Daily Tribune that lost sports editors. If you go and you look down the list that's on our links blog, you'll find that a lot of other papers in communities similar to ours lost their sports editor. Tuscaloosa, where the University of Alabama, they lost.
Where football's even bigger than it is
absolutely.
here.
They lost several staffers, including their editor. And I looked at that and I went like, how could you, I mean, you're talking about major powers here. How could you let those people go?
Well, having been through a few rounds of these at the news organization that became this big behemoth when I worked at GANNETT, it isn't that the papers aren't going to have a sports editor. The sports editor will be somebody who's much younger than the person who had the job, most likely. And what is happening, and in some ways, it's great for our students. They have all these opportunities. You know, I kiddingly say to our students, hey, if you can walk in and say you can Facebook, you'll be the managing editor. But it's only half a joke. And so what's happening in the business is you're losing a lot of institutional memory.
That's the part that
and
scares
that
me.
is the part that is very scary because you know, young journalists have great energy and new ideas, and that's wonderful. But absent the institutional memory, I think viewers will feel a lack and readers. And I think the other thing is, do we really want a world in which all the journalists are unmarried people who are 25 years old? I mean, one of the things we strive for in newsrooms is diversity. Diversity by demographics as well as race, life experience. That's the only way we can really say that we can overcome bias, because as we all know at this table, the bias that's hardest to get rid of is the bias you don't know you have because of where you were born or how you grew up. And having a diverse newsroom helps counter that. But if the only jobs left are starter jobs, that's really scary, not just for journalists, but also for our readers, viewers, and listeners.
I think the other issue you're going to have is that, as we've seen with Gatehouse, they tend to pull everything into hubs. So a lot of these jobs are going to go into a hub where
the SEC sports editor,
absolutely,
the Big Ten sports editor, the Big 12 sports editor,
and that person may be, maybe sitting at a desk, hundreds of thousands of miles away, and given this perception that they're actually covering the sports that's in your town, and that's not necessarily what's happening.
So, Kathy, you raised another good point about, that newsroom full of 25-year-olds. And one of the things that I would always say to our students as we kind of gave them, especially as we kind of come up on commencement this week, kind of that little push out the door, is that they may think they've learned so much here in the 2 or 3 or 4 years that they've spent working in our newsrooms or in the School of Journalism. But I tell them they're never going to learn as much as they are in that first year on the job working full time.
Yeah.
That, like in my case, I think I had 4 promotions in my first 18 months. Like that's where the largest amount of growth happens professionally. And I fear what happens too when some of those mentors aren't there too. Like, they're the most important teachers that some of our students are going to experience as they go out into the professional world.
I mean, I feel very fortunate because I came up at a time when I did have mentors and role models and people I could go and ask for advice. It's a lot harder when the sports editor graduated a year before you. So I think this is one of the things and I think this is one of the reasons that you're seeing a lot of philanthropic money, even just this week, poured into local journalism projects. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about some of that, and I think it's important. But one thing that's a little bit worrisome, there are a lot of wonderful efforts underway to support local journalism. But if all you're supporting are the people who are the beginning reporters, I don't think you overcome this problem. Communities deserve to have somebody who's hung around and been in that community for a while to supervise the coverage. And I think we all know the benefits of having somebody who's a longtime reporter or a longtime editor be in a newsroom. And that's where I think even the philanthropic efforts haven't gotten to that yet.
But, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the fact that what's gotten newspapers in this predicament is their inability to be able to figure out an economic model that works. And what has happened is because there's been that, they've been in that spot, you have others who come in who are looking at it purely from a dollars and cents perspective, and they think, what is the value we can get out of coming in and doing this? You have the Alden Group, you have the Gatehouse Group, you have others who have moved in, and their whole philosophy is we want to extract as much value as we can out of it. And if that means we have to lay people off in order to do it, we have to shrink our coverage area, we have to do all of these things which are detrimental to what you just described, then that's what we're going to do because we're beholden to our shareholders and the managers of our hedge funds.
So you bring this up, and it reminded me of Friday. Chicago Tribune columnist Mary Schmeek wrote a column that was among the most heartfelt pleas that I've read in a long time, calling on someone or a group of someones with a civic-minded focus to come in and take control of the paper. This was written in response to Michael Farrow selling his majority stake in Tribune Publishing to Alden Capital, which is the group that we know and have talked about many times, decimated the Denver Post. Today, there's word, too, that Tribune employees, both at the Chicago Tribune and the other 6 papers within that group, have written a petition to the ownership group to really make an investment, with more than 400 people, employees, having signed it. A real effort there within the operations to try and point out to Alden Capital and to some of these hedge funds and these ownership groups that there is still a product there that needs to go back to its roots and its reason for being, that it isn't just an entity to be out there to make the greatest profit possible.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that newspapers for so long were so profitable, and newspapers tend to own the most prestigious piece of real estate in town. And that's what Earnest is talking about, that these hedge funds come in and they see, oh, well, we'll sell off the real estate. I mean, they've already done that at the Chicago Tribune. It's turning into a luxury
$1 million condominiums
exactly.
right there.
So I think I think the question is, we've gotten away from the model where the owner of a newspaper was a member of the community and had some sense of obligation to that community. Now, it's a lot easier to support public interest journalism when you're making double-digit profits. Those days are gone.
Long gone.
And so the question is, who's going to step up? I mean, I think it's still possible to make a profit in journalism. It's just not going to be a double-digit profit. And is the payoff going to be enough for these institutions, and they are institutions that are so important to communities to survive? The problem with some of these takeovers, like Gatehouse taking over GANNETT or Alden maybe stepping into the Tribune, is in order to do that, they're taking on this enormous debt to do the acquisition, and then they have to lay people off so they have enough money to finance the debt. It's not even so much that newspapers are in a terrible shape. It's just the financial deals that were used to acquire them put them in terrible shape.
And that's been the situation when you go back and you look at all of the takeovers. The way in which Kathy described it is exactly what's happening. I mean, McClatchy is the same thing. You had the same thing with the Media General, and now you've got GANNETT, and then you're going to have Tribune. I mean, the only stability that you're actually seeing within newspapers right now is with the Washington Post and the New York Times, and a lot of that is because you have one owner. And if you just sort of watch the pattern, what eventually is going to happen is that you're going to have national media in the form of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and you'll have these little sub-regionals throughout the country, but you will have huge news deserts in this country if we keep going down this path.
Which is a little bit that pattern that you see in TV news, too, where you also have cookie-cutter TV stations owned by large ownership groups, that you also have large swaths because of the way that it's Sinclair, and the way that DMAs are drawn. There was a great piece, I'm trying to remember who had published it, I think it was the Associated Press, maybe about 10 days ago, maybe a little bit longer, about how our demographic areas and our market areas now are drawn in such a way that even if you were to look at a market like ours here in Columbia and Jeff City, this is a 17-county market. And so Columbia and Boone County gets covered very heavily, Jefferson City, Cole County gets covered very heavily, but there's still 15 other counties in this market that unless there is some major natural disaster or a heater case, a big crime case, we're never going to go into those areas, and that creates a news desert too.
Absolutely.
Right, and that creates a invitation to corruption, because we all behave better if we know somebody's watching.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And if nobody's watching, watch out.
Right.
Okay, so maybe there is a solution to this down the pike. As teeny tiny as it might be, Report for America announces that it's adding 250 reporter positions to newspapers across the country. It seemed like as I went through Facebook last week, everybody I knew at a different newspaper from different media diasporas are saying, hey, we're adding to, apply, let me know what you want to do. We'd love to be able to get you to come here, especially going after some of our recent grads, maybe people who are graduating now or have graduated in the last year or two. It's a start, but 2 people isn't going to add back everything that's been lost.
No, but it is a start, and I think I think we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Sure.
I think we have to celebrate this. Also this week, the American Journalism Project, which is another philanthropic organization, spun off really out of the Texas Tribune, announced its first grants, and they are going to local news organizations. So I think the good news here, if there is good news, is that there's a increasing awareness of what's happening out in the country and of the importance of local news. I think, though, that Earnest is right. Newspapers missed the boat when the digital age came along, and figuring out how to pay for public interest journalism is really, to me, it's the moonshot of our generation.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think what's happened with Report for America, what's happening in these philanthropic opportunities that the news organizations take, I think it's all great. What I think is missing from some of this is that everyday coverage that people really rely on, because that is just, it's not sexy enough for the philanthropic opportunities that come through. They want to have something big. They want to have a big splash, that sort of thing. And so what you're going to see with the Report from America and others are these sort of projects that you see on Sundays and on the weekends and that sort of thing. You won't see that everyday coverage. That's where I think news organizations have to figure out an economic model to be able to sustain that everyday coverage that people really rely on.
Okay, well,
amen, brother.
As we approach mid-December, people are making their list and checking it twice. Which movies they'll be catching in theaters this Christmas season. There's a new one opening Friday from Clint Eastwood that's gaining attention. Richard Jewell. It's the story of the man wrongfully accused of the Centennial Park bombing at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta.
Jewell fits the profile of the lone bomber, a frustrated white man who is a police wannabe who seeks to become a hero.
We're running it.
Olivia Wilde plays Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter Kathy Scruggs, the journalist who first reported that the FBI was looking at Jewell. And the paper is not happy about the way that she has been portrayed in that film, demanding that Warner Brothers acknowledge that it has taken some creative license in the storyline. In the film, she is seen sleeping with John Hamm's character, the FBI agent, to get the tip for that story, which is not at all what happened.
Yeah, and the Journal-Constitution is pushing back and basically saying, look, you need to acknowledge that this is not what happened. And then you have Clint Eastwood and those who are banking the Richard Jewell movie basically saying, look, we've said that we took creative license. We're not going to say anymore. One of the things that's important here is that we're trying to correct the wrong. We're trying to show that this man was basically railroaded, and the newspaper was part of the apparatus that did that and tell that story.
Couldn't they have done that, though, and still told that story without adding part of that storyline that didn't exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it comes down to the old saw, two wrongs don't make a right. I mean, people are really angry, and the Richard Jewell case was not journalism's finest moment. We certainly, I've taught that case to talk about how law enforcement can sometimes use journalists, and just because it is a law enforcement authority doesn't mean it's always something to go with, and that's what happened there. But this is a story. It is not a story of purely fictional story. It's a story about something that really happened. And the reporter here is someone who really existed. And so this is really borderline libel. And she is not a public figure.
No. And she passed away
exactly.
almost 20
so
years
she
ago.
Cannot
so this
defend
is also,
herself.
She cannot defend herself and speak for herself. Right. Another part of this that's problematic for me, that's really kind of troublesome, is this idea of coming back to that trope over and over again in Hollywood movies or in television shows of that female reporter who's going to do anything, read between the lines there, to get the story. We saw it in House of Cards. We saw it in Absence of Malice. Help me out here, Kathy. This isn't how we do our jobs.
This is the worst part of it. I mean, I can't believe that hello, Clint Eastwood, Me Too. I mean, this is just, to me, this is, thanks a lot, buddy. I mean, as if this is the only way women can succeed. That's, that is what is being said here. And so the idea that he's undermining a profession, and I admit, this was not journalism's finest moment, but that he would go back to this Mad Men kind of ancient, hoary old trope about women can't succeed unless they're horizontal. Please.
Well, I mean, to me, I everything both of you said, I agree with. What bothers me about these kinds of historical movies is when they take the poetic license. And generally when they do, it usually turns out bad, as it happened with this one.
And the problem with taking that poetic license is there are going to be a whole lot of people who don't know the actual history who will walk away with this as what becomes the collective memory.
Right, because this becomes...
I'm telling you, the historian, you don't know that.
Yes, I mean, and that's the part that bothers me is because you've thrown in an inaccuracy that people will hang on to, and that will become, this is what I know about what happened in this case.
It's so gratuitous because you didn't need to do it.
Yeah.
That's right.
It's just taking a gratuitous shot at a professional woman. I thought we had gotten past it, but clearly not.
Okay. Well, after the holiday movies and the holiday feasts comes the New Year's resolutions to get back in shape, right? And you might assume that was what Peloton was banking on with this commercial.
Okay, you ready?
Yes.
Now.
A Peloton? Give it up for our first time ride.
All right, first ride. I'm a little nervous, but excited. Let's do this. 5 days in a row.
Instead, it became the laughingstock of the internet for how cringeworthy it was, for the unintended message it sent that this already fit woman was obsessing about exercise and documenting it for her husband, who seemed to think she wasn't fit enough that he bought her a high-tech exercise bicycle. The backlash is pretty strong here. I have to ask you, do you think it's warranted? Was this a tone-deaf ad? Was it misinterpreted by the cancel culture that is the internet? What are your reactions to this one?
I don't get it. I mean, I've seen I saw the commercial, looked okay to me, and then I started reading the stories, and I'm like, and so I looked at the commercial again. I'm going like, okay, yeah, she is fit, okay, but most of the people on the Peloton commercials are fit.
People built like me aren't the ones who are thinking about being in a Peloton. I'm not going to sell any exercise bikes.
Right. I mean, how often do you see people in any kind of exercise commercial actually look like they need exercise?
Well, I think what this came down to is, I mean, really, is this what you want to give somebody for Christmas?
It's like a vacuum cleaner? Like giving someone a vacuum?
Exactly.
Well,
This reminds me of one of my former newsroom colleagues who came in after complaining for a long time about not being able to figure out what to buy his wife and daughter-in-law. And he came in late one night, about 3 days before Christmas, and threw down a small flat package on his desk. And he said, "There it is. I did it. And what is it?" And he said, "It's a shower curtain."
Awesome. I was going to say, what do you get her, an iron?
So never let a reporter buy your Christmas present.
Okay, well, before we go, we have to hand it to the social media team at Netflix. They opened the floodgates on the most R-rated meme of the year this week. They asked people and brands, what is it that people can say during sex, but also while running a social media account for a brand? There was not much chill here in the Netflix and chill, but some of these responses were not only creative, they were hilarious. And some of these brands that jumped in on it, Discover, Charmin, Dr. Pepper, Wendy's, Ben & Jerry's, Universal's Orlando Resort. We're talking family-friendly brands that showed they could have a sense of humor, too.
I mean, I think any opportunity that you can take, if you're a brand, any opportunity that you can take to get out in front of an audience and promote your brand and be funny about it, you got to take it. You got to be careful, but I think you have to take it. Peloton, we just talked about as being one. So,
but I think, you pointed it out, it's the cleverness. I mean, they were creative.
Every one of these were on brand.
This was not kind of really, it didn't cross the line. It was all funny, double entendre, and it was really, I think, a creative challenge.
It was. I mean, one of the ones that made me laugh, too, was about, like, Charmin with their tagline about it being Heine clean, or about Petco and enjoying the new toys. Like, some of these were so creative that it was...
I mean, and to me, the other thing is that Netflix got a lot of, they really took off on this because every time one of the brands mentioned it, they had to refer back to Netflix. So it was smart. It was really smart.
It was really smart, and it really channeled, our strategic communication students are so creative, and the professors are so creative, and it really showed you kind of the fun side of advertising. I mean, and kudos for them for giving a challenge that everybody else wanted to rise to.
Right.
Okay. Well, we are pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us today. You can read more about each of the topics that we talked about on our links blog. You can find that under both the programs and the podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also available wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. Leave us comments, questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next time, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Aaron Hay for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher composed our original theme music. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again in 2 weeks when we're back with you for a special Christmas night edition of Views of the News.